Hi everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski are taking a look at one of the graded stakes races on Saturday at Belmont at the Big A. 6 furlongs on the turf course at Aqueduct is the distance for race 6, the Belmont Turf Sprint, a grade 3. And Craig, we've got a field of 12 signed on, and this feels like the most competitive of the graded stakes races that they're running at Aqueduct on Saturday. It's a pretty wide open field. I did install the number 1 Big Invasion as the morning line favorite at 5-2, but he doesn't have to win this race by any means. You can make a case for a lot of horses in here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. This is not a race I would have wanted to make the morning line for. Based on past action, I wouldn't argue at all with Big Invasion being the favorite, but I definitely think he's got some question marks based on his form this year.
Let's take a look at the Timeform US pace projector for this 12-horse field in the Belmont Turf Sprint. And there is some speed in this race, Craig, quite a bit of it. I'll be interested to see if one horse in particular ends up running in this race. That's the number 6 Pirate Rick, who we know is very fast on the dirt. Doesn't really, or hasn't shown that speed on the turf. I wonder, with some rain in the forecast, if he's a horse that's entered thinking this race might come off the turf. We'll see how that all plays out. But even, disregarding Pirate Rick, the number 7 Today's Flavor has speed. The 11 and 12 Dancing Buck and Nothing Better both have speed. So you could see this pace potentially heating up for some of the closers.
Yeah, I agree. Even if Pirate Rick were to scratch, I think this would still be a race that's labeled with the fast-paced flag, and I have no argument with that. The one question mark I would have is that Today's Flavor is shown on the front end, and in his lone turf try last out, he did show he was able to rate a little bit on this surface, so it's not like he has to have the lead.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about him. Some of that early projection might be based more on his dirt races than his turf race, but there is still speed to his outside that could force this pace. Well, let's go through this field, and we'll begin with some horses that are coming out of the Harvey Pack Stakes from Saratoga, 3 of them in particular. We'll take a look at the stretch run of that race, and the horse that gets the job done this day in an upset is the number 9 Thin White Duke. He runs down the favorite Big Invasion, who did get bet down to 6-5 favoritism on this day. The horse in the pink silks on the rail is Dancing Buck, and Thin White Duke spins widest into the stretch and is just able to stay on to get these horses right at the wire. This was Thin White Duke's 4th start of the Saratoga season this summer. I think he might have been the horse that ran the most races at Saratoga during the summer season. He loves it up there, and they definitely try to get as many starts into Thin White Duke at Saratoga as they can each year.
Yeah, he's a horse who obviously doesn't mind running a bit. Plenty of career starts at just the age of 5. His form's a little bit in and out. He always seems to show up, but I would argue that was his most impressive race to date. There wasn't a ton of pace in that race at just 5.5 furlongs. His main rival that day, Big Invasion, was able to slip through after a ground-saving trip, and it didn't matter. Thin White Duke had built up that momentum on the outside, and he just wasn't to be denied.
Yeah, Thin White Duke is one of those horses that really does need the pace to heat up to have his best chance. And I think he found the right circumstances last time, a smaller field, no traffic to deal with, and he was able to make that big late run. We'll see if he could do it again against 11 rivals. Also out of that race is the number 1 Big Invasion. And like you were saying, Craig, he was on the inside early, found that seam in upper stretch and was able to split horses, but just couldn't hold off that late surge down the outside of Thin White Duke. I was making the point, I've made it, I think, with you on our Pacecast and on these previews, that late in the Saratoga meet, I feel like on the Mellon turf course, the outer turf course, you wanted to be in the outside paths. Even when the rails came down, you did not want to be down on the inside. We saw a lot of winners coming down the center of the course, just like Thin White Duke did. So maybe that ground-saving trip that you would think is good for Big Invasion wasn't quite as beneficial as you would think it would be. And now, Greg, he's second off the layoff after that trip overseas, so he might be set for a better effort anyway.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the rail, because even though I mentioned this race had all blue fractions, it certainly didn't have that kind of flow with the top 2 being near the back early on. Granted, Thin White Duke, he was a price. I mean, Big Invasion was the favorite that day, but it is certainly something to keep in mind. I'm still a little bit skeptical that he's the same horse we saw at 3 when he was dominating the turf sprints in New York. Maybe he is the same horse, and that's actually my point. He hasn't really taken a step forward, but second off the layoff, coming back from England, maybe you want to give him another shot, but I suspect he's going to take money like he always does.
Yeah, definitely a pivotal race for him. You can make some excuses. He had traffic trouble in that turf sprint at Churchill back in May. The overseas trip to compete at Royal Ascot, probably ill advised. But this is the race where he is supposed to show up and get it done. The other horse coming out of the Harvey pack is the number 11, Dancing Buck. And, Craig, this is actually the defending champion in this race. He won the Belmont Turf Sprint over a yielding course in October of 2022, so could find himself with a similar course condition on Saturday. That would definitely work in Dancing Buck's favor. But also, he's now second off a layoff, coming off the bench in that Harvey pack was always going to be a tough assignment for him. And I think he's the horse that was really against the flow of that race, because not only was he hugging the rail, he was setting the pace in a race where the pace really did come apart.
Yeah, and he's a horse who always shows up and runs his race. When you look through his PPs, you find very few efforts that you were say were subpar. I do question what kind of trip he's going to get. There's some much faster horses in here than what he's used to. When you look through his PPs of late, you see nothing but blue fractions, certainly no red ones. So I do wonder about that. With the outside post not being ideal, I think he's in for a tough journey that he's not used to.
Couple of horses are coming out of the DeHaas Stakes at Colonial Downs. Let's take a look first at Aragon, who was narrowly beaten that day, going off at 9-1. He looked like a sure winner with about a 16th of a mile to go, Craig, as he forged to the lead, and then somehow No Balls found a resurgence and was able to run him down after looking well beaten as the favorite in that race at the top of the stretch. Aragon is sort of an in and out horse. When he's good, he runs well enough to win a race like this, but he sometimes has trouble putting those top efforts back to back. And he's got sort of this good race, bad race pattern going right now.
And I would classify that last one as a good one. So maybe you're expecting a decline here. The one upside I would say is he is just a 4-year-old, which on turf for me is almost like being a 3-year-old on dirt. He's still getting better. You can see it when he does run his good races. His speed figures keep ascending, and that 117 last time would certainly make him a contender in this spot.
The number 4 is Yes and Yes. He is coming out of that same DeHaas Stakes at Colonial. And Craig, I didn't think he got the best trip that day. He's a horse that I always have trouble understanding how the connections decide to ride him, because he is a horse that has shown a lot of tactical speed in the past. And it seems like they always just want to take him off the pace. They did it last time at Colonial. It didn't work out. He even ran into some traffic in the late stages of that race. He ran well too back in that select stakes at Monmouth, got to the lead in mid-stretch before getting run down by Aiman, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. I think this horse, when the trip works out, is pretty good. I just wonder if he's good enough to beat a field like this.
As I scroll through his PPs when I was handicapping this race, it really stuck out to me that this horse is actually really consistent speed figure wise. The problem in this field is we have a race rating of 119, and he basically maxes out at 115, and most of his figures fall in that low 110, 112 range. So it just seems to me like even if he shows up and runs his best race, it would be competing for minor shares.
The number 5 is Aiman. He's the horse that ran down Yes and Yes in that select stakes at Monmouth 2 back, and he overcame an unfavorable pace scenario to do it that day. He was really rocketing down the center of the turf course to get up with a late rush. He came back in a tougher spot last time, $1 million purse race at Kentucky Downs that just turned into a blanket finish. There were, I think, 7 or 8 horses within a length of each other at the wire, him included. But even though he only lost that race by a length, Craig, when you go back and watch the replay, it never looked like he was really getting there.
No, it doesn't. And he's kind of got the same issue as Yes and Yes. His best speed figures are his last two when he ran a 112 on the Timeform US scale. And that's a little bit lacking in here. I don't put a whole lot of stock in those Kentucky Downs races when horses ship out of there to other tracks. But his race at Monmouth basically was the same speed figure wise. So it just seems like he's in a little deep.
The number 6 is Pirate Rick, and he's an interesting horse in this race from multiple fronts. Obviously, his injection of pace into the race, because he has a lot of early speed on the dirt. We saw it last time when he led from gate to wire, coming off the layoff at Pimlico. But this entering him in a turf race is interesting, Craig. He did try turf once, much earlier in his career, before he turned into the kind of horse that's capable of running the speed figures that we see from him now. So maybe he has the capability to be better on turf these days, but I do wonder if he's really intended for this surface.
Yeah, I tend to agree. He's run on synthetic as well, which some people like to compare to turf, but I'm a little skeptical of that. Even though that turf race was a long time ago, it's still his speed figure regressed from what he was running on the dirt. He's a fast horse, no doubt, but I don't know. It seems like they were just taking a shot. I would be surprised, like you mentioned in the beginning, if he actually runs, and if he does, I only view him as a pace factor.
The number 7 is Today's Flavor, and let's take a look at his most recent start, which was his only turf race. It took him 13 starts in his career to finally get on the grass, and he showed that he handles it pretty well, at least as well as he handles the dirt. And he also, Craig, showed a new dimension this day because he had been a speedball type that was a need the lead horse on the dirt, and he was able to rally past some foes in this turf race. So some likable attributes shown from Today's Flavor to get up and beat Nothing Better, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. Nothing Better is pretty game coming onto the wire, trying to come back on Today's Flavor, but Today's Flavor is able to hold him off in that turf debut.
I was impressed in his turf debut. As you mentioned, he had shown some, not just speed, but some crazy high speed, particularly when he set the pace in the grade one Carter. I was only beaten a little over a length that day. So I like to see that he was able to transfer that to turf. And more importantly, that he was able to rate a little bit off the lead. It doesn't mean you have to take him off the lead if circumstances dictate, but I think he's pretty good and may have found a new lease on life because he really struggled in open stakes company on the dirt.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how they ride him because he definitely has the speed to be forward in here, potentially on the lead. But sometimes when connections have success doing one thing, like taking a horse off the pace and having them rally, they just try to replicate it over and over again. So maybe they won't ride him aggressively. We'll see how that all plays out with Today's Flavor. Nothing Better is the other horse that we saw in that replay. And he was pretty game, Craig. He's always pretty game. I mean, he's involved in the finish typically. He's a horse that likes to be in the exacta, and he was trying to battle back at the end of that race inside of Today's Flavor. He's run well over this Aqueduct turf course, going 6 furlongs in the past. And you can make some excuses for his races 2 and 3 back, obviously being in way too tough in the Jaipur, but still running a really nice race against Caravel, Big Invasion, and Casa Creed that day. And then 2 back, just kind of got shuffled out of position in a race that had a ton of speed at Monmouth. This time, though, he's drawn to the far outside post position.
Yeah, I wonder how tough that post position is going to be. There is some speed, as we've mentioned, but he's a fast win. I'm not positive Today's Flavor is going to go to the front, as we discussed, or even want to go to the front. And outside of Pirate Rick, I don't think he'd have a whole lot of trouble clearing. So I wouldn't let the post hold me back on Nothing Better. Maybe he's, they regressed a little bit, but that last race looked pretty good to me. And I think he's a contender here.
Yeah, with that post position feels like one that could get somewhat overlooked, and he's got those 120 plus time form US speed figures that you do want to note in a race where a lot have not earned figures like that before. The number 8 is Fauci. Let's take a look at his most recent start at Saratoga when he was closing for second in an optional claiming race. And Craig, I think this is just like the quintessential replay for Fauci because he typically runs well. He makes this big late run, looks like he might win it, and then just doesn't have that extra oomph to go by in the last 16th.
Yeah, he is a horse who was gelded after a long layoff. Not sure when exactly he was gelded, but surely before he returned. The problem is he's just still been the same Fauci. He runs, he kind of hangs in the lane, and he does it in races that aren't particularly fast, and certainly not fast enough to win a race of this quality.
And then last contender we'll mention is the number 10, Wit. And he's sort of an intriguing runner in this race, Craig, because he's going to try something that he's never done before, and that is sprinting on the turf. He's sprinted just on the dirt, and he's run on the turf, just going longer in route races. And he's done both of those well. So maybe if we put 2 and 2 together, he'll be a turf sprinter in this spot. He is, though, a horse that does not possess very much early speed. So he's going to really need things to heat up on the front end.
I am pretty interested in this horse, as we'll see when we get to the selections, because I've always thought this horse was more of a sprinter than a two-turn type horse. He's been trying it repeatedly on the grass with some success, but mostly not success. So I admit he has a few things against him, but I really like that Florent Giroux takes the mount. He rides these turf sprints as well as anyone. And given that the pace could be hot on the front end, I'm not going to be surprised at all if Witt runs well.
Well, Craig, I think I hear where you're going with this one, so let's get right to our picks for this race. And I see that you put Wit on top, and I get it. I mean, he's a horse that definitely is a proficient sprinter. I had trouble with his last race. It was not a good effort off the layup from the Bernard Baruch, but if he needed that spot, you could get a price on him in this turnback.
Yeah, I was disappointed in that last start, but I'm hoping it was just kind of a prep. Maybe they had this in mind all along. Who really knows? But I'm just sticking to my guns that I really think this horse wants a sprint. He's shown that he can handle turf. So I think he might get overlooked in the wagering in a race where there's really a lot of different directions you could go.
And Craig, I think you know by this point I've got a little bit of a soft spot for Nothing Better. I've picked this horse on quite a few occasions, but he just always gives an honest, solid effort. And I think some people might steer away from him here with that outside post position. But like you said, as I went through this field, there weren't that many horses that I think have to go and need to be forward. And he always breaks sharply from the gate. So I think he might not get as bad a trip as some people might estimate in this Belmont Turf Sprint. So the number 10, Wit for Craig, and the number 12, Nothing Better for me in race 6 at Belmont at the Big A, the Belmont Turf Sprint. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.